there. And go back to there. All right, just get everything lined up. I think that is all in order. Everything's in place. Hope that you're all doing well tonight, or whenever you happen to be watching the video.
How's the family?
We're all doing very well, thank you.
Good.
I hope you're doing well too.
Yes, we are. Thank you for asking.
Just give it one more minute for late arrivals. All right, so let's go ahead and get down to work. So we are wrapping up chapter 5 to start, and then we'll get into chapter 6. And in chapter 5, Mishnah 9, we are dealing with Mipnei Darchei Shalom. This is another section where we are being given rules, takanot, instituted policy that are for the ways of peace. In this case, the shalom, the peace, is being established among different types of Jews, specifically Jews with different levels of observance, as we would call it in the modern way, different reliability for observing the Jewish law. Although the rabbis in the Mishnah and in the Talmud as well speak almost all the time as though they were talking to a universally committed Jewish population, the fact is that during their days, just like ours, a large percentage, and it is impossible to know exactly, but a substantial percentage of Jews kept some of the commandments, but not all of the commandments. And of those that kept some, there were some that also followed the rabbinic teachings in some areas and didn't follow the rabbinic teachings in other areas, preferring their own private interpretation of Jewish law. Sometimes this was out of ignorance. Sometimes this was out of disagreement. Sometimes this was simply because they were unwilling to exert the effort needed to keep the commandment as Judaism, rabbinic Judaism teaches. So how do you live in a community that is a shared space where people around you are not keeping Judaism the way you believe Judaism is meant to be kept? In the modern world, of course, we have a few answers to that. One is to shrug and just, they do their thing, I do my thing, and that's it. A more extreme version of that is to simply say, they do their thing, I do my thing, and I will never talk to them and interact with them, and I will build a social cocoon around myself so that no one of differing interpretation or observance levels will ever come into contact with me or my family. As we're going to see in chapter 5, Mishnah 9, that is not exactly the technique that is being discussed here in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is finding a different way to interact for the sake of peace, while still preserving our own commitment to Judaism and halakha. And I find this absolutely a very illustrative, a very insightful, a very wise Mishnah that hopefully will have a good guiding effect for your own interactions with different people in Jewish life. With enough, let's get down to the business. A woman may lend to another woman who is suspected of not observing the sabbatical year a fan or a sieve or a hand mill or a stove, but she should not sift or grind with her. All right, what's going on here? So the laws of Shemitah are quite complicated. This is the sabbatical laws, but very, very short version is that things that are gathered during the sabbatical year can only be gathered freely. They are not official property or crops, as we are not allowed to plant crops for those years. If someone does make use of that produce, after the time when it should not be kept, then they are violating Jewish law. In general, in Judaism, we do not assist someone in violating law. If someone comes to you and says, hey, can I borrow your gun so I can go rob someone's house? You say no. You don't let them borrow your property so that they can commit a transgression. Here, the Mishnah is trying to draw a distinction between allowing somebody to use an object that may or may not be used for a transgression, but to avoid actually performing the action with the other person when there is a high likelihood that it is a transgression and that you would be actually helping them to fulfill that transgression. So the example given here is for baking bread, essentially. And in the steps of baking a bread, you have a fan to winnow the grain, where you would throw the grain that had been broken into the air, and when you fan it, the light parts that are not used blow away, and the heavier kernels will fall back down. Sieve, of course, is for sifting through those kernels to make sure that only kernels are coming through rather than anything like a rock, and the hand mill for grinding it, and the stove, obviously, for baking it. All of these can be lent to a person, even if you're not sure, and in fact, actually suspect that they are not observing the sabbatical year properly. There's no guarantee that they're not. There's no proof that this particular bit of grain that they are dealing with was kept in a way that would make it impermissible for the sabbatical year. But nevertheless, you can lend her an item, and if she chooses to use it for something that is forbidden, in terms of using it for these activities in ways that are not acceptable during the sabbatical year, then it's on her. But you can be a good neighbor, and you can lend that fan, that sieve, that hand mill, that stove, and have a clear conscience. However, they draw a line of sitting down with her and saying, okay, you throw it in the air and I will fan it. You grab the other end of this basket and we'll sieve it together. Or here, let's grind the flour together, and that way we'll share the effort. Then you are actually engaging in the very direct, proximate activities that are forbidden. It's one thing to lend a tool that may or may not be used for something forbidden. It's another thing to grab the other end of that mill and grind with her something that is actually forbidden. So there is a limit to how far we'll go for being a good neighbor for the sake of peace. But there is also a minimum of what we should do for the sake of peace, even if we think that person might be having a transgression. Something might be similar in the modern world would be if your neighbor who was Jewish, who you think maybe doesn't always observe Shabbat correctly, if they ask if you have spare candles, you may suspect that they are going to light the candles after sundown and after Shabbat has begun, thus transgressing, but you don't actually know when they're going to do it. And so, being a good neighbor, you should give them a set of candles to be able to use. And that way, it'll be fine. Now, if it's already definitely nightfall and you know that they are going to absolutely walk from your house into their house and light them, then yes, then we say, No, but next week I'd be happy to get you some. It's about that establishment of peace, of rapport, of maintaining the lines of neighborly, good communication without allowing ourselves to transgress or to very unavoidably put that person in a position where they will be transgressing. We don't want that on our conscience either. We're going to get another example of this, unless there's a specific question regarding the mill and such in this part. We're going to get another example of finding the balance between being a good neighbor and maintaining Jewish law. All right, so let's take a look at part 3. A wife of a chaver. A chaver means somebody that is committed to rabbinic Judaism. They are careful with the laws of purity, things that are tameh and tahor, that are impure and pure in a ritual sense, and with the concept of tithing. These are complicated things that were often either completely ignored or at the very least observed in a very half-hearted way by much of the population. So if a wife of a chaver, meaning she is in the group that cares about these laws, a wife of a chaver may lend to the wife of an am haaretz, those are the people who do not care about these things, a fan or a sieve, and may winnow and grind and sift with her. So again, here we see, because it's not sabbatical year, that even though this person that is your neighbor is not so careful with regards to the laws of purity or the laws of tithing, you can do an awful lot together. In addition to lending these items, you can also participate in many of these actions. There is nothing inherently wrong. You haven't crossed the line, even by grinding or sifting with someone that you know is not going to be so careful with the results once it's done. But once she has poured water over the flour, she should not touch anything with her, because we do not assist those who commit a transgression. Once the flour has touched water, as we've discussed in passing numerous times, then it becomes susceptible to ritual impurity, to tumah. And so at that point, you cross a line. Also at this point, we can become more concerned that whatever impurity they have will become transmitted to the item. Because like I've said, once it touches water, then it is susceptible to impurity. So when we're not sure whether they're keeping pure, or in fact, we think they're probably not, we can do lots with them in ways that have no problems at all, even up to and including much of the work. But once you cross that water threshold, then we can't participate because we would be committing a transgression. This idea of going up to this far, up to this point, ad kan, this up till here, but not further, that is a very important mental state of being, to find how far can I go with this person, to be their friend, to be their neighbor, to be their helper, to show them the best of Judaism, and yet still also remember that there is a level beyond which I can't go. And that is tricky. When we get committed to a relationship and we are dear friends with someone, we want to do up to and including everything. It's what friends do. We don't want to say no. And there is much that can be done, even with a person whose observance is problematic. But we still have to make sure we don't lose ourselves in that friendship to such an extent that we end up actually violating a commandment. It's the equivalent in the modern world. If you have a friend who asks you if you can help him move, yes, of course. And that move day is going to be a Saturday. Sorry, no. I can help you pack up the days before and load up the boxes and tape everything shut and wrap things in newspaper. And I can help you on Sunday unpack and get everything set up in your new house. But Saturday itself, that's Shabbat. I'm not going to be loading and unloading the truck with you on that day. So finding a way to do as much as possible with others also goes a long way to helping them understand that although there are limits because of my faith, that doesn't mean I don't care about you. Of course I do. And I will do everything that I can within the limits of my faith to show that. Aaron, you have a question.
Yes, Rabbi. Does it seem like the line drawn is you can do enough that would give them the opportunity to commit the transgression, but you cannot commit or conspire with them to commit the transgression? When I read this, that seemed like the line that the rabbis were drawing.
I'm not sure about the first half. The second half, I think I do agree with your formulation, which is that you cannot do anything that actually is participating in the transgression. In this case, for example, with the water touching the flour, you are actually helping them to make it impure. And so that would be the line. But doing things that have a secondary, ancillary effect that could be and even may probably put them in a position where they will eventually be able to commit the transgression, that is okay for the sake of peace. Now, again, this whole section that we've been doing for a couple of weeks now, the thing to keep holding on here is the rabbis are trying to tweak our natural instinct to avoid doing anything with these other folk and saying, no, you're right, you could, and your instinct might be to do nothing, to just cut them out, lock the door, pull down the blinds, never associate with them at all. But that isn't actually necessary. In fact, for the sake of peace, to avoid that kind of strife and anger that would grow in a community where people turn their backs on each other because of different religiosity, we are going to make it explicit that you can help in ways that even seem to be aiding and abetting with their eventual transgression, but you still have to remember not to join in the transgression itself. So I hope that sort of formulation makes the distinction clear.
Yeah. What I was talking about in the first one, since I guess that's where the confusion lies, opportunity means, make it where it's possible for them to commit the transgression, where conspire means I know you're going to do it. Like the candle one, you said, if somebody says, hey, will you give me a lighter so I can light my candle on Shabbat? You can't give them the lighter because you're helping them do it. But if somebody just said, I need a bucket of water, not knowing what they're going to do with it, but they could potentially pour it on the flour, that would just be opportunity to do it. That was the distinction between the two.
Right. I think where I lost track was that you're using terminology that I imagine is more technical in the American legal system due to your training, whereas I tend to resort to common English usage of words. So things like opportunity and conspire, I get where you're coming from now. When conspiring, you're actually engaging in activity that makes it not merely possible, but actually be fulfilled, actually take place.
Yeah, you're helping engage in the legal activity, even though you're not doing it.
And yeah, that's a fine way of putting it then.
And the other question I had is about the religiosity. I always like to bring up the Mishnah where Hillel and Shammai would eat at the same table.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a distinguish between their religiosity within a set of when I read this, I thought it was in people who were not religious or not keeping religion, but differentiations in religion to some extent is acceptable to like impure, to do stuff that would be impure with one religion but not the other.
Right. Well, they all, I mean, in this whole section here, for section for Mishnah 9, we're dealing with Jewish people. We're not dealing with people that are not Jewish. We talked about a little bit about that at the end of Mishnah 8, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, I think.
Right.
But here we're talking not about religious or non-religious Jews. We're talking about Jews whose concept of religion is different than the other Jews' concept of religion. It's hard for us to understand because the Am Haaretz in the classical sense isn't really a category of Jews that can stand up and speak for themselves. The only records we have of them are the records of the rabbis, who are not they're not very flattering in their description of the Am Haaretz. But the Am Haaretz didn't have a tradition and a written record because they were Am Haaretz. They were in a way almost leading a folk religion, meaning that they practice the religion that they practice as a culture that included many of the aspects that were actual commandments. Like I would expect that the Am Haaretz of classical Israel, they weren't eating pork or things like that. But the more careful details of the halacha, things that we need to study for weeks at a time, if not more, here in Mishnah class, maybe they didn't know or they didn't care. And they figured, I'm just doing what I kind of know. And I'm not bothering to study more. I'm not bothering to deepen my knowledge. And I'm definitely not going to worry about the details of many of these things. I'll ballpark it, if you will. Like I said, they're not around anymore, and they didn't leave writings because they didn't have a set tradition. If they did, then they wouldn't have been Am Haaretz. So it's hard to know exactly how religious they were, meaning how observant they were. But if it is like the modern world at all, and that's a big if, but given that we are still around, it's quite likely, then an Am Haaretz is a person that isn't committed to a particular brand or flavor of Judaism. This is not Reform, Conservative, Orthodox type differences. This is somebody that is a cultural Jew, that they identify as Jewish if asked. They keep some of the commandments. They're not going to eat bread on Pesach, but maybe they are not exactly careful about the halacha of Shabbat. Not because they've made a philosophical religious decision about it, as someone who's Reform might, but just because they're indifferent to the idea. That's where we're talking about for an Am Haaretz. Almost in the modern world, what we would call a secular Jew, but still very culturally attached to the practices of Judaism, if not the underlying ideas, and certainly not with all the details.
But that's why.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, if they're more than secular, if there was some religious aspect, though, where do they differentiate between those of the house of Hillel and Shammai versus the Ha'am Haaretz? Because I always thought the Ha'am Haaretz were the not so observant Jewish people who did believe in a lot of the stuff from Hillel and Shammai, since they were community standards, but they weren't so careful to observe all the commandments. That was my understanding of the Ha'am Haaretz.
So let me first get the differentiation between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. So Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, like any of the other differing schools of Jewish thought in the ancient world that were within the rabbinic spectrum, they had different interpretations of particular points of Jewish law. But their interpretations were still within the network, the framework, the rubric of general rabbinic Judaism. They were still using the same techniques. They were still referring to the same sages. They were disagreeing on secondary points, but they were still playing the same game and playing by the same rules as each other. Just like in a modern game setting, if you are playing baseball against someone, at the end of the game, you may have both disagreed on the umpire's call, but you can still sit down and have a beer together after the game. Whereas the Am Haaretz, they didn't really know the rules of the game. They've watched baseball. They've maybe played it sometimes. They know what the ball is. They know what the bat is, that kind of thing. But they're not really playing baseball. They don't really play by the rules, and they don't care what the umpire says. They are out on the field, if you will, but not really engaged in the same way. And that puts them in a different category than the Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel type disagreements. They're really outside of the main rabbinic framework. still Jewish, still behaving in ways that are very similar to what is official for many points, but doing so for their own reasons and their own inertia, not because they are committed to the actual rules of how the underlying job of Judaism gets done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking about in modern times that comes up a lot today, where people say that section's outside the acceptable framework of Judaism.
So in the modern times, that gets bandied about a bit too much. People will attack others as being not acceptable Jews, or they're beyond the pale, and all of that. And while certainly the action of different Jews that are either crooks or criminals can certainly be beyond the pale of acceptable Jewish practice, we try not to write out other Jews as being beyond the pale, at least myself and my colleagues in the conservative movement. We can disagree, and we will often very loudly disagree with actions of all types of groups and of pronouncements or patterns of behavior from all types of groups, but they're still Jews. Now, when it comes down to relying upon them and their observance, then yes, that's going to be different. My ability to rely upon the observance of somebody that has publicly made it clear that they don't care about kashrut, for example, in any way, shape, or form, is going to be different than somebody who keeps kosher, but maybe keeps kosher in a way that is slightly different from me. And that is something that we then have to navigate in the ways of peace, trying to find a way to both bridge the gap without compromising what is actually the law. All right. On that same topic, first we get the little bit of a bridge here. All these rules were only said because of the ways of peace. Again, reminding us that these rules were put in place not just because the rabbis thought it was a good idea, but precisely because they wanted the society to be able to function together as best and completely as possible, while still maintaining a level of protection for what needed to be guarded. But part 5, and again in Rabbi Kolb's translation, is going to be a little bit more surprising. Gentiles, non-Jews, may be wished luck in the sabbatical year, but not Israelites. Luck in the terms of their harvest and their work. And greeting may be given to them, because of the ways of peace. Okay, so sabbatical year is a little surprising, because even though according to our law, none of the land of Israel should be worked in the sabbatical year, regardless of who owns it, we were often unable to enforce that, especially during the time of the Mishnah, during the Roman occupation. But you might then think that we would be bitter and nasty to the non-Jews who were working the land. Nonetheless, as a way of maintaining general societal norms, we can say, "B'hatzlacha," good luck. I hope you are successful. We can extend that general form of good-natured, neighborly goodwill, even when we know they are doing something that we think they shouldn't. Likewise, when we talk about greetings here, this is generally understood as giving greetings to them, even if it could be seen as endorsing some of their behavior or their religion. And we're not going to ignore them. We are not going to shun them. We are allowed to engage. In fact, there are many that comment on this section and go into much more detail, that even up to and including wishing someone a happy holiday on a non-Jewish holiday is perfectly permitted, mipnei darchei shalom, for the ways of peace. I know personally that many Jewish people are loath to wish someone a Merry Christmas or something of that kind, but technically, for the ways of peace, there is nothing wrong there, as long as you are doing it for the the good relations that we should have with one another, not because you believe in their religion, then it is a perfectly fine greeting to extend. Now, I will confess personally that given the attempt by many in the non-Jewish Christian American world in particular to act as though Christmas is under attack and that we are all being demanded to talk about how great Christmas is so they don't feel hurt, I do bristle at throwing around Christmas greetings willy-nilly, because I do think that it is overdone, and I think the clutching of pearls at the war on Christmas is also just ridiculous. But if I am talking to a neighbor or to a friend that I know is Christian, wishing them a Merry Christmas is perfectly fine and absolutely appropriate to make sure that you are maintaining that sense of relationship. And likewise, I don't feel any offense if they wish me any happiness or goodwill for any of my holidays. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, just out of curiosity, what do they mean by the ways of peace? Because is it under Torah law that any of these things are prohibited, or are they just clarifying that, hey, you can do this?
Yeah, meaning that there are ways to interpret how our relationship, in this case with non-Jews, should exist, that especially if you're talking about, like the rabbis of the Mishnah, about idolaters, that we should do nothing that gives them at all a sense of pleasure, peace, acceptance, and that we should be grinding their idols to dust and throwing it into the Dead Sea. And you could interpret that up to and including even just a simple happy holiday kind of statement. And what the rabbis are saying here is, no, you have permission to be a little bit more gracious than that for the sake of peace. And that is something that can be safely extended in this situation.
And a final question, since the example you gave was talking about other religions, and this one does not seem to be talking about other religions, is the only reason we're allowed to wish people Merry Christmas is because Christianity is a non-idolatry religion?
No. So this text may look like it's not talking about religion, but as the rabbis in the Talmud and later commentaries point out, there's nothing wrong with giving a greeting to a non-Jew that's just good morning. That's no one would ever think that was prohibited. That is clearly okay. So if that is clearly okay, then when might I think I'm not allowed to extend a greeting to them? And the interpretation that's generally followed is even on days that are holy to them, I am allowed to extend that greeting.
And by holy, you mean if they were going to worship Zeus or something, you'd be able to extend some kind of greeting?
Happy Zeus Day. Now, yes, it's the idea that we should be completely isolated, cut off, and rude to non-Jews is a relatively controversial topic, and one that's had its ups and downs depending upon our own relationship with the powers that be among the non-Jews. When they have been especially oppressive and destructive, obviously we are less likely to be willing to be considerate, and at least in private, people could be quite rude. But when there was more tolerance and acceptance, then yes, Judaism was okay with us being not rude to our neighbors, even in their ways of faith. Again, having to be very clear that we are not engaging in that activity. We are merely being good neighbors. All right, and with that, we make a sharp turn in chapter 6, back to divorce. I know, it's been a while, but chapter 6 returns to the topic of divorce, and in particular, the topic of agency, shlichut. So we've talked about this before, but always a quick reminder helps. An agent is a person who has been authorized by the, in this case, husband or wife, to handle part of the get delivery, either delivering it itself or to receiving it. So we're either sending or taking it in hand. That agency can get more complicated though, because really it adds an extra squishy bit in between the sending and the receiving. In the vanilla, oldest, simplest version, the man would have the get written, he would pick up the get, he would hand it to his wife, she would take it there right in front of him, and boom, the whole divorce ceremony would take place. Once you start putting in, I'm going to take this get and I'm going to give it to a guy and he's going to take it to my wife, or he's going to take it and give it to somebody that will accept it on her behalf, who will then take it back to her. Well, now we've got this squishy agency in between, and we have to make sure we know what to do with that. So that's where we're starting in chapter 6, Mishnah 1. If a man says, receive this get on behalf of my wife, or carry this get to my wife, if he desires to retract, meaning before his wife has actually received it in her hands, if he wishes to cancel it before it gets to her, he may do so. So he has given the get to an agent, and that agent is going to head out and give it to his wife. If the husband chases him down before he arrives, very important, before he arrives and gives it to the wife, the husband can say, whoop, 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 change my mind, give me that back, canceled, not getting divorced, not sending the get, we're done. While it is still in the agent's hand, it is the same as though it were in the husband's hand. And just like he could hold it in his hand and then put it away, deciding he doesn't want to give it to her, so too he can stop the agent from giving it to her by retracting his approval for the get before she has taken it. As always, once she has taken it, it's done, it's in her hands, and there is nothing else that can backtrack on it. All right, so that's from the husband's point of view. Next section. If a woman says, receive the get on my behalf, meaning she is sending the agent, maybe to the husband or to the court, and saying, go there and accept the get on my behalf. She is appointing him to act as her agent, accepting the get, not merely being the postal guy, but actually formally accepting the get on her behalf. And he does so. If the husband wants to retract, he may not do so. So because the wife has designated this agent as receiving on her behalf, once it is in the agent's hand, it is as good as if it were in the wife's hand directly. Thus, once it is in the agent's hand, the husband can no longer retract any more than he could retract if it were in the wife's hand physically. So her appointment of that agent allows him to operate as an extension of her, just like the agent of the husband is operating as an extension of him. Make sense? Any questions?
A quick question.
Yes.
So since the wife's able to appoint a agent, that means she must have substantial rights to contract and conduct business too, right?
That's right. That's right. People often like to make blanket statements of, women had equal rights or women had no rights in ancient Judaism. And really, it's just much more complicated than that. Women did not have what we would call equal rights in all aspects of all things in ancient Judaism, but also women did not have zero rights in all things that were going on in ancient Judaism. It was very complicated. And women had many rights that might surprise people to this day, and they lacked certain permissions that might surprise people. Here, the woman absolutely has the right to appoint an agent to receive the get on her behalf, and that agent works the same way as it would be if he were appointed by a man for any normal type of contract. However, there is a small wrinkle, which is the next section. Therefore, if the husband said to him, meaning the wife's agent, I do not want you to receive it on her behalf, but rather carry it and give it to her, then if he wishes to retract, he may do so. So because the husband is the person who is actually the only person authorized to make the get happen, the husband can actually change the appointment of the wife's agent. He can say, I am changing you from being a receiver to being a deliverer, essentially making him like the husband's agent, the delivery agent itself, which will then mean that his appointment has been altered, and now the get will only be valid once it reaches the wife's actual physical hands, which means that there is then still a window for the husband to retract until it reaches her hands. So like I said, she has lots of rights, but this is one place where he can change her agent in a way that shows there is still an inequality in the action. Yes, sir.
Where does he get the authority to change the agent status? If she says this is my agent, how can he say no, it's not?
Because he can say, I'm not giving it to you as her, I'm giving it to you as my postal service. And since the husband is the person very literally in charge of the get, meaning that it has the authority only because of his intent, he is able to override it in this case. He and the wife are not equal in this ceremony, in this situation. And the husband's wishes with regards to how it will be delivered and such do supersede her wishes in this way. Like I said, equality is not something that we're going to find in every situation. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, even if the wife says, take for me, and he does so, the husband may not retract. What Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is trying to say is that even if she doesn't use the phrase receive for me, but instead uses a more pick it up for me, a more generic term for accepting it on her behalf, that is good enough, that is clear enough that when the agent receives it from the husband, it counts as though the wife has received it at that moment, and the husband cannot retract from that point on. So he's trying to say the wording does not have to be 100% precise. If she says, bring it to me, then usually that would be taken as a possibility that she was trying to just have it be delivered rather than actually take effect from receipt. 6.2. And we are still talking about agents. Secret agent. A woman who said to an agent, receive my get for me, requires 2 sets of witnesses. 2 to say in our presence she told him, and 2 to say in our presence he received the get and tore it. Tore it again being sign that the get has been delivered and thus cannot be forged to be used for someone else. Even if the first set are the same witnesses as the latter set, or if there was one in the first set and one in the second, and one joined with them for both testimonies, it's valid. So like everything else in Judaism, well, almost everything else as we've found, you need 2 witnesses. So if she appoints Mr. Cohen to be the agent, there needs to be 2 people watching her do that appointment, and are they then able to testify? Absolutely. When Mr. Cohen went and got the get, he was getting it on her behalf because she appointed him in our presence. Likewise, when Mr. Cohen shows up and the husband gives him the get, we need 2 witnesses to be able to say, yep, we saw Mr. Cohen receive it. And at that point, we have valid testimony. Of course, if there are the same two witnesses, so you have Mr. Cohen plus Shmuel and Reuben, and Shmuel and Reuben go with Mr. Cohen and are there for both the appointment as well as the receiving, that's okay. You can have the same witnesses do both jobs. If you have Shmuel and Reuben at the first one, and you have Shmuel and Judah at the second one, so Shmuel overlaps between the two, that's also okay. As long as you have two valid witnesses at both events, it's all kosher. And now an additional wrinkle, because what is law without the wrinkles? If we didn't understand the wrinkles, then we wouldn't know what to do when it gets hard. Like I said before, it's easy if you have the vanilla case where the husband has to get written and then hands it to her, and it's all done very clearly. This is why we need Mishnah, because sometimes things get hard. If a young girl, this is a na'ara in particular, meaning not a yalda, not a girl below the age of 12, but also not a bogeret, not a fully realized adult in the eyes of the law, which happens at 12 and a half. So we're talking literally about a 6-month window here. If a young girl is betrothed, both she and her father may receive her get. Rabbi Judah said that two different hands cannot take possession as one. Rather, her father alone may receive her get. So the difficulty here is that being a na'ara in this in-between time between 12 and 12 and a half, the difference between pre-dawn and full daytime for her childhood into her adulthood, she has more rights, but she is not completely beyond the rule of her father's house. Therefore, during this in-between time, the argument is who can actually receive the get. The Tana Kama, the first opinion, is telling us that both of them can receive the get. If she receives it, it's kosher because she is mature enough to be able to have that. On the other hand, her father, who was the person in the ancient world that would have been arranging the betrothal before she was this age in any case, he can receive it too because she is still under his legal authority because she is not yet fully mature. Either one are capable of receiving the get. For Rabbi Yehuda, no, that's just too confusing. Instead, he is the opinion that only the father should be allowed during the 6-month window to be receiving the get. In that same theme, one who is not able to keep her get is not capable of being divorced. Capable of keeping her get means a child that is too young to even understand what divorce is, and thus she couldn't even keep it. Just imagine giving a 6-year-old an important document like their birth certificate and saying, all right, now keep this safe. The vast majority of 6-year-olds are not going to be able to keep something safe. And even though, yes, the get is not normally kept in the possession of the divorcee, but instead she is given a document that says she has been divorced, the point here is still salient. You can't give a get to somebody that young, and thus you cannot divorce them, which means that you are kind of stuck. If you want to divorce a girl that was betrothed, in this case, it would have been by her father, to someone else, if that someone else wishes to divorce her before she is of mature age and thus able to actually get married, he is going to have to just wait. He can wait until she is a na'ara, or he can wait until she is a full adult, but he cannot divorce her when she is still too young to even understand what divorce means. Yes, that does mean that he is stuck supporting her at this point. But yeah, as Rabbi Kolb's commentary points out, remember we are talking about what is actually legal or not legal, what are the requirements or not requirements. We're not talking about what is moral or ethical here. It is about applying the law when someone perhaps has not behaved ethically, or at least not in a clear ethical way. And we need law in those situations, and this is the answer for that situation. Yes, Aaron.
How come this rule applies to the girl who's too young, that she has to remain married, but they said it's all right to give the get to the imbecile?
So with regards to the imbecile, if you remember, that was a special dispensation, if you will, a special takana, in order to make sure that somebody could marry her in the first place. That if you made it so that they were unable to ever receive a get, then people would not be willing to marry someone of limited mental capacity, because they would be unable to even exercise the option of divorce at any point afterwards. At that point, people would simply refuse to marry someone of limited capacity, or would divorce somebody in advance of thinking they might become mentally incapacitated. And that's not necessarily in anyone's interests. It doesn't mean that person should divorce and abandon someone that is mentally incapable. It means that someone should have the opportunity, the right to be able to do so, but hopefully we'll find a better solution for any difficulties they may be having.
So, Rabbi, the main question I have is, what part of this is Torah law and what part of this is Dei Rabbanan? Because it's my understanding that the general rule is a guy can give any girl a get and be divorced. So now we have some situations where you can and can't. So is the first one where you divorce the imbecile a Dei Rabbanan, or is this one a Dei Rabbanan, or am I just missing the mark?
No. So this general opinion, where if somebody is not considered legally capable, is the default Torah position. If they are not yet of legal majority, then they cannot engage in legal acts unless there are some extenuating circumstances. And the extenuating circumstances we talked about before were explicitly a takana, was a rabbinic enactment for the general well-being of the community, to allow somebody with limited mental capacity to be divorced. So this is the default position.
So this is the default position. The rabbis have the ability to create leniency within Torah law?
Of course. I know. Shocking, isn't it? I mean, that's what a takana is not only to create leniencies, but also to create stringencies. The rabbis would often debate and then act that in many situations, it didn't seem like they had the authority to seize property from somebody as part of a fine or penalty. But the rabbis knew that they needed to. So even though the Torah had not granted them always that authority in a way they wanted, they still exercised that authority. If we want to get very radical, during the Middle Ages, under some of the Muslim rulers in Spain, the Jewish community had the right to adjudicate its own laws up to and including capital punishment. In those situations, there was a great debate. The rabbis in those communities did not believe they had Torah authority to execute somebody, because that authority was derived from the Smichut and the Sanhedrin of Israel that they were not part of. Thus, execution should be forbidden to them. It would be the equivalent of murdering someone, because they were not duly ordained with that level of judicial authority. However, the debate eventually settled that if the community did not exercise the right of capital punishment within their community, then the Muslim leaders would. And that would mean that people might be sent to the executioner in ways that were not compatible with Jewish law. Either the innocent might be executed, or people against whom there was invalid testimony might be executed. And as such, the community said, although the Torah may not grant us the authority under these circumstances, we are going to be lenient on the restrictions of who can administer capital punishment, and we will allow ourselves to have that authority for the good of our community. For the situation will be worse if we don't use it.
Yeah, and Rabbi, Joe Roth put this out in the halacha process. He was talking about that Torah law should be interpreted strictly, while rabbinic law should be interpreted leniently. And then he goes on to cite that these rules are not really followed that well.
Exactly right. I love Rabbi Roth's book that you just mentioned, the halachic process. It is really an excellent book for understanding how Jewish law actually works. Not all the ins and outs of any individual law like we're handling here in Mishnah, but the actual way things get decided in Jewish law. And it's not even a very thick book, although it is, difficult. It does require you to understand a fair bit going in. But I highly recommend you at least try it if you haven't already read it, for anybody else that's watching. But he is very realistic about how things actually have been done. Yes, there are certain principles, and yes, there are certain statements, but in practice, whether it be Midrash, Mishnah, or Talmud, or whether it be the Rishonim, all the way through Shulchan Aruch, and certainly in the Achronim that come afterwards, we find things that don't fit the laboratory settings or the white room descriptions that are made in other parts of Jewish text. That when rubber meets the road, things often will be a little bit messier than that idealized kind of statement. That doesn't make the ideal wrong. It's still important to hold to. It is still important to know when it needs to be flexed and when it doesn't. But we have to also recognize that this is not computer science. This is not the kind of thing that can be reduced to zeros and ones. The decisions are not purely binary, if you will. All right, and with that, I think that we'll sign off there. I don't want to begin 6-3 with only 3 minutes left. So we will wrap it up here for tonight. And I will wish everyone a wonderful evening, and hope to see you all again for Mishnah or anything else that you're able to join me for.
Thank you.
Take care and be well.